All right, today we're diving into a really significant document, a UN Commission of Inquiry report that takes on one of the most serious charges in all of international law, the allegation of genocide in Gaza. We're going to deconstruct it by following the report's own logic, step by step, to understand exactly how it builds its case. So, right from the get-go, the report doesn't pull any punches. It states that it's already concluded that crimes against humanity and war crimes were committed, and it frames that as the starting point for its next and even more specific task, tackling the issue of genocide head-on.
Here's how we're going to break this down, mirroring the report's own structure. First, we have to understand the legal framework for genocide. Then, we'll look at what the report calls the underlying acts, followed by its assessment of special intent. And finally, we'll get to the Commission's ultimate conclusion.
So, first things first. Before we can even touch the facts on the ground, the report lays out the legal foundation. I mean, what does genocide actually mean under international law? We have to understand that precise definition first.
Okay, so this definition is really specific, and you've got to pay close attention here because it has two absolutely critical parts. You have the acts themselves, but then you have the intent to destroy a group. The entire argument in this report really hinges on proving both of those things.
Now, the law lays out 5 very specific actions that can be considered acts of genocide. For this report, the analysis really zooms in on the first 3: killing, causing serious harm, and deliberately inflicting destructive conditions of life. The report notes that it didn't find evidence for the last 2, preventing births or forcibly transferring children.
So this is probably the most important legal concept to get your head around. Think of it like a 2-part test. You need the physical act, the actus reus, but that's not enough. You also need the dolus specialis, that very specific intent to destroy the group. And the report makes it super clear that proving this intent is the highest, most difficult bar to clear in all of international criminal law. All right, so now that we've got the legal stuff down, the report moves on to that first pillar, the physical acts, the actus reus. It starts to examine the evidence it gathered for those first 3 categories: killing, causing serious harm, and creating conditions meant to cause destruction. So, to start building its case for that first act, killing members of the group, the report begins with this number. It states that from October 7, 2023 to the end of July 2025, over 60,000 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. And then the commission drills down into who these victims were. It breaks down the fatalities that had been verified by mid-July 2025, and it highlights this figure, that women and children made up nearly half of the dead. This is a statistic that it comes back to later in its analysis. But the report argues it's not just about how many people were killed, it's about how they were killed. It details the methods it says were employed, pointing to what it calls a pattern of attacks on places you'd think would be safe, like evacuation routes, hospitals, and even targeting people who are trying to surrender. And to really bring home the human cost, to move beyond just the statistics, the report uses direct testimony from survivors. This quote here is from someone who survived an airstrike on their family's home, describing in their own words what that moment was like. Okay, but remember that 2-part test we talked about? All of this, all these physical acts, as horrific as they are only half the story in the eyes of the law. The report is very clear that this is only the first part of the equation. So, this brings us to the second, and arguably the most difficult part of the legal test: proving intent. The report now shifts to analyze what it calls the dolus specialis, looking at public statements and patterns of conduct on the ground to try and infer it. So, how do you even begin to prove something like intent? Well, the Commission explains its approach right here. It says it looked for 2 kinds of clues: direct evidence, like explicit public statements, and circumstantial evidence, which can be inferred from a consistent pattern of actions over time. The report then starts laying out its evidence, cataloging a number of public statements from top officials. It highlights language like this quote, which, in its analysis, it describes as dehumanizing. Here's another example the Commission points to, one that it argues seems to blur the line between fighters and civilians, essentially assigning a kind of collective responsibility to the entire population. And then there's this biblical reference, which the report flags as particularly significant. It explains that in the original context, the story of Amalek involves a command for the total destruction of an enemy group, including men, women, and children. But, it's not just about what people said. The report argues that you can also see intent in a consistent pattern of actions. It looks at 4 big areas: the siege and aid blockade, which it interprets as being calculated to destroy the group, the systematic targeting of healthcare, the destruction of cultural sites, and the use of sexual violence. The argument here is that when you look at all of these things together, the only reasonable inference is an intent to destroy. All right, so after laying out the law, the physical acts, and the evidence for intent, the report ties it all together to arrive at its final conclusion. So, based on all that analysis, the Commission lands on its final conclusion that both the physical acts and the specific intent, the actus reus and the mens rea, have been established, and that the conduct of Israeli authorities meets the legal requirements for the crime of genocide. So what happens now? What are the implications of a finding like this? Well, the report lays out what it sees as the legal consequences. It says Israel has a responsibility to stop these acts and punish those responsible. And, critically, it says that all other countries that sign the Genocide Convention have a duty to prevent and punish the crime. It's an obligation to the entire international community. So the Commission has laid out its case, its evidence, and its legal conclusion. The big question this report leaves us with isn't just whether its findings will be accepted, but how a document like this might actually shape international law and what it means for the responsibilities of every country in the world.